Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode in my perhaps slightly self-indulgent effort of telling the story of my life, together with lots of other sub-stories. So last time we'd gotten to the point where I'd spent the summer of 1977 in the US at Argonne National Lab near Chicago. I turned 18 that summer. But maybe I should set some a little bit more of my personal context and so on, and then we'll keep going with the story. So probably when I was 11 or 12 years old, I got really interested in physics for the first time. And if you'd asked me the age 11 me, what are you going to do when you're grown up? I would have said, I'm going to be a physicist. When the things I was kind of doing at age 12, I moved from elementary school to high school. The classifications are slightly different in England, but that was sort of the typical age, so to speak, to do that. And I went to a school called Eton, which is kind of a very old, fancy school, so to speak. It's a place that was much more emphasized, kind of training the future politicians and generals and so on, than anything to do with things like science. I think the time, just to set some sort of context for the time, I mean, it was as I think I mentioned before, there were sort of two populations at Eton: the kind of the scholarship kids like me, and the general population, which included lots of kind of people who'd been going to Eton for N generations, people who were part of the aristocracy, and so on. And if you ask the question, well, what did people do? When people who sort of finished at Eton, what did they do? At that time, it was sort of a transition to it started to be the case. Probably by then, more than half of the people were going to university. But that means half weren't. And they were doing things like they were going into the army, which was kind of still a sort of, maybe still is a prestige sort of thing in the UK. Or they were going to, quotes, manage the family estates, which at the time, when I heard people saying they were doing that, it's like, so you're just going to be lazy for the rest of your life. Of course, I've realized subsequently that managing some giant land that's being farmed and all that kind of thing is actually pretty hard work, or can be pretty hard work. But that wasn't what I thought at the time. But then when it came to sort of the science crowd, scientists in the general media at the time in England were often referred to as, boffins, and they were portrayed in white coats and so on. Science was not viewed as being such a prestige thing. It was viewed as being something that was kind of part of the people with kind of grease on their hands, kind of almost blue collar type of thing, relative to the kind of the leaders who were far above the science, so to speak. And actually, Eton as a school had produced, as I mentioned before, many well-known politicians, writers, all sorts of other kinds of things, not so many scientists. I mean, I think for a while, if you looked up sort of scientists who'd gone to Eton, you'd find me maybe listed in recent times, and then the most recent predecessor would be a certain Robert Boyle from the 1600s, who was the person who invented the gas laws and so on. Another chap listed often was a chap called William Outred, also from the 1600s, who had the distinction of inventing the multiplication sign as well as inventing the slide rule. But so at least when I was there, it was still sort of science was this thing that sort of got done, and there were certainly teachers and classes and all that kind of thing, but it was definitely not the thing one sort of expected was the main flow of what people did. I think I mentioned before my good friend Nicholas Kermack, who unfortunately died at a young age, although he would have certainly become a politician. That was his plan, and that was what he was preparing for from the age of 12 and so on. He and I used to, there was this kind of morning assembly, and in a kind of modernization of the school, they sometimes sort of turned that over to the kids, to the students to run. And Nicholas Kermack and I were common volunteers, and there weren't so many other volunteers. And so it was a good exercise in public speaking and so on, not least because it was a big, hall with 1,200 people or something. And this was before there were microphones and loudspeakers and all that kind of thing. And so you had to actually learn how to sort of speak clearly enough that anybody could understand you at the back of the room type thing. But I would say that we put on quite a number of, I think, quite interesting discussions about a variety of topics, sometimes in what I would now consider good taste, sometimes in not such good taste. But that was so, at the time, my sort of outward visible kind of activities were things like I was a pretty good writer and pretty good speaker and so on. And I was also off doing lots and lots of science, largely on my own, which certainly people knew about, the kids I was around knew about, but I don't think that was the necessarily obvious from the point of view of sort of the school establishment. I don't know quite how visible that was. And certainly then when I got to the school leaving age in England at that time was 16, I mentioned before, there was this sort of loophole in the way things worked. So if you got a scholarship to Oxford or Cambridge, you could skip the government A levels type thing and just go to college. So I was kind of for a while proud of being able to say I left school at 16, so to speak, which in the sort of UK speak of the time meant more or less I wasn't a serious person at school. I wasn't very academic. I was just, was going to go into some trade or something like this. But I, had other reasons to leave school at 16 because I was kind of going to go to college. I have to say that the sort of teachers, administration, whatever at Eton was very much like, oh, you don't want to do that. This is a really bad idea. You'll be so sort of socially, out of place, and so on and so on and so on. And I mean, I realize in with the wisdom of hindsight, there were definitely signs that I wasn't actually as kind of immature or something as you might have thought. I mean, there were plenty of kids there who were quite immature, doing all kinds of crazy things, which I never did. I was probably a very, the boring kid who just does kind of does science and does things and organizes stuff and so on, but none of the crazy stuff. And but I also was quite an organizer kid, and I organized many kinds of things. I think I mentioned some before. And as I realized many years later, and maybe I'll tell the story of when I started my first company in the early 1980s. One of the things that was sort of a mistake was not having the self-image that, oh, I'm this, person who can organize stuff and so on. I was very much, I'm the academic nerd type kid, even though I don't think I was that nerdy. But I was certainly academically oriented. So in any case, there was kind of a big, oh, you shouldn't go to college early, it's a terrible thing to do. I think part of the data that led to that belief was a chap who I never met, whose name was Simon Norton, who was probably, I don't know, 5, 6 years older than me, who had gone to Eton, in college at Eton, a scholarship person, and was a real math whiz. And won the math Olympiad, all this kind of thing. And by some early age had sort of gone through all the math that could do at Eton, and then had been sort of sent off to do kind of a commute into London to go and sort of do some external degree at London University in math. Okay, so then I guess he got to the end of sort of the Eton time, and then he ended up going to Cambridge and doing another math undergraduate degree, which didn't go very well. And now you have to also know about Simon Norton, who again I never met. I exchanged email with him many, many years after this. But he was a chap who memorized train timetables and could do all those kinds of things that you kind of expect from sort of a very different kind of personality than the one that I am, for example. And so I think things had not gone that well for him. In later years, he did some interesting mathematics and classification of finite groups and some what one might think of as very nerdy mathematics, so to speak, but quite successfully so in his later years. Although I think the train timetable thing kept going and so on. I think he worked for London Transport actually for a while, figuring out the train timetables after having memorized them at earlier times. But in any case, that was sort of the model of what the go to, get through school quickly person was, at least for the sort of the teacher type people at at Eton, and that was a model which I don't think fit me very well. And so, there was a lot of, oh, you shouldn't go to college early, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway. So I did, and as I mentioned, I spent my sort of gap time between high school and college because of the way that the years align at a place called the Rutherford Lab, government lab in England, doing theoretical physics. It was always the Rutherford Lab was in a um, rather lovely physical location out in the rolling green hills. I think it's still out in the rolling green hills. I think nobody built around there. I was also very notable at the Rutherford Lab. It was something that always amused me was that you'd arrive there and there was a big British flag flying. And at the time, maybe it's still true, you never saw British flags anywhere. It's like this is a reminder, this is a government place where they actually are sort of supporting the flag, flying the flag, and so on. But it was a place which had good computers. It was well connected to the ARPANET. I think in addition to using sort of algebraic computation uh, for the first serious time there, I also got exposed to another thing, which was online referencing systems. The fact that you could go and do a search through the abstracts of all papers about physics and search for keywords and things like this. It was a thing that I think for some reason, basically only librarians ever tended to do. But, there were terminals where you could do this. And I started doing that. And it meant that when the web finally arrived, decade and a half later, it was a little less surprising to me because I had been sort of searching the scientific literature for years in, just using online databases, originally things called InSpec and kind of an aggregator called Dialog and so on. That that one could get access to. But anyway, so after my time at the Rutherford Lab, as I mentioned before, I went to Oxford, and as a physics undergraduate in England, a university, unlike the US, I have to make some translation here. It's a 3-year thing. College is a 3-year thing in England. It's always just one well, except for various combination subjects, it's usually just one subject. So I was just doing physics. I have to say that I had met a lot of very interesting people when I was in high school who've gone on to do lots of interesting things. When I got to Oxford, for some reason, I didn't wind up meeting so many interesting students or ones that I've stayed really in touch with much, at least among the undergraduates. There was some graduate students who I interacted with. I mean, the way that Oxford works, it's broken into these colleges, and they're both undergraduates and graduate students at these colleges. And I was at one called St. John's, which I learned many years later is the richest of the Oxford colleges. At least I think so. I didn't know that. There was no evidence of that at the time. But although I did have, it had very, very lovely kind of old buildings. And at least the first year I was there, I had these lovely rooms in some nice quad. It was kind of one of the better accommodations I've had in a long time. Very, 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 very nice. But in any case, I would say that uh, for whatever reason, the undergraduate crowd, one met people from other colleges if one was out and about going to undergraduate lectures, which I didn't go to. The only thing that I consistently did do, because it was sort of on offer, and one didn't need to go to the lectures, as I mentioned before. The only requirement was take the exams at the end of the year. But in any case, the one thing that was sort of on offer for physics students was sort of a weekly or so experiment. And so I always used to do those. Uh, my I had a lab partner for a while named Andrew Holland, and I have lost track of him. And maybe I saw him last 15, 20 years ago. He'd become a plasma physicist, I think. Um, but in any case, it was always for me, it was kind of an interesting experience actually doing physics experiments and actually, it was helpful to me to see things in real life and actually, plot the data points and see that these effects that I knew theoretically quite well actually did work. Meanwhile, I mean, my main activity for myself had been writing physics papers and so on, and doing physics research and such like. I interacted a bunch with the graduate students at the time, There were a few, oh, there were a few notable ones. There was a chap called Ash Carter, who was a Rhodes Scholar, a very American fellow. And I didn't know that many Americans at the time. Um, he um, uh, he was actually also happened to be at the same college that I was at. And he was struck me as a very confident fellow. He worked on QCD kinds of things. Actually, his advisor was a person called Chris Llewellyn Smith, who was also the person who'd sort of recruited me and was supposed to be dealing with me. Chris Llewellyn Smith went on to become quite a science administrator. He was director of CERN, for example, at the time when the web was invented there. And I have to say, I saw him around that time, and I was like, what are you going to do with the web? This is probably 1990, oh, I don't know, one or so. What are you going to do with the web? This seems like a great thing. And he's like, well, I don't know, because, CERN was created to, by a bunch of governments, sort of with the main meta objective of being, get all those scientists from all those different countries to collaborate with each other as a matter of sort of international relations. And, they paid us to do particle physics, but is it really, what should we do with this computer innovation? And I was like, start a CERN computing operation and, declare victory. As it was, the center of kind of web research moved to the US, and that didn't go so well. But anyway, Chris Llewellyn Smith happened to be the PhD advisor of Ash Carter, graduate student who I knew, and who was working on QCD kinds of things. Well, I sort of lost track of Ash for a while, and then he reappeared and eventually became Secretary of Defense in the US under Obama, and unfortunately died rather young recently. But I had reconnected with him by that time. But that was an outcome I didn't predict. He had been involved a lot from particle physics. He went into kind of nuclear disarmament kinds of issues and so on. In any case, that was one character from the graduate student crowd. I think the it but so I guess the uh, so after from my time at the Rutherford Lab, I had met a bunch of physicists, including American ones. That's how I wound up going to Argonne uh, for the summer of 1977. And it was, definitely that was, I had mentioned I visited the US once before, maybe a year and a half earlier, but not for long. But that was my first real exposure to American culture. And there were definitely things that were hard for me to understand, and were things which were kind of very different from the UK situation. I mean, I always found the directness of Americans sort of very refreshing after some of the kind of indirectness of the UK. I mean, the UK was at the time at least a much more homogeneous culture, and people could say things in a very nuanced way, and people would actually understand them. So, when somebody says, "I just couldn't say," it's like, well, that means a definite thing, and you can, and in the US, I think because it's a much more heterogeneous culture, it's kind of like you have to say what you mean, otherwise nobody's going to understand anything. I do remember, for some reason, I don't know, the shortly after I got to Argonne, I remember um, being at some sort of party put on by one of the physicists there, and this person's wife sort of introduced herself. I'm Penny and I belong to Denny, and that was for me a very very American moment. I mean, it's just not something you would hear in. Unfortunately, they got a divorce later, but that's a different story. The It's not something you would hear in and sort of that kind of bouncy presentation is not what you would have typically seen in the British situation. I mean, to explain the British situation a bit more, there was certainly a sort of intensely knowing about things wasn't necessarily sort of thought to be the right thing in a kind of sophisticated conversation, and you would get into these situations where people would be kind of the world expert on this or that thing, and the subject would turn to that thing, and they would kind of sort of feign ignorance of many of those topics. I always found that very frustrating. But in any case, I always used to say about the UK that was also a good country to be old in, but not a good country to be young in, because it seemed like there was always this great respect for the old. I mean, people would say of the 70-year-old chap, they'd say when he was, you know, 16, he did this amazing thing. And I was like, that was a long time ago. You know, what did he do since? Was it anything? And at least that was my point of view back then. And I always thought that there was sort of an irrational respect for the old relative to the energy of the young, so to speak. And I always thought, well, you know, it's whereas in the US there seemed to be much more kind of a an energy, an idea of energy and sort of an interest in the energy of the young and so on. I might have to say that after half a century later, I think the UK has changed. And I think that well, it might be a good place to be old in is probably not true anymore. So one loses on that particular count. But in any case, I remember certainly in the adapting to American everything, even the language, which you think is the same language, is really not the same language. I mean, I have to recall an absolutely mortifying experience going and I wanted what in American would be called an eraser. And I went to the sort of place where the sort of administrative staff were, and I asked some young woman there, you know, do you have a rubber? Which, you know, is the right word for an eraser in British English. Well, that was a very confusing interaction and quite mortifying. But anyway, so I learned a word of American in that interaction at least. Um, and just to give a, I suppose, a sense of kind of, you know, Argonne National Lab is in this, again, very lovely kind of wooded area outside of Chicago. And, you know, there are deer bouncing around, all those kinds of things, very pleasant. I have to say, near the kind of the sort of you know, apartment-like things that they had, there was this kind of collection of trees where there was a there was an area of those trees that was all sort of tangled and destroyed. And people said, oh, last summer there was a tornado that went through there. Um, but again, one of those things that one doesn't know about coming from the UK. But so in that summer, I sort of decided, okay, I'm going to move to the US. My point of view was there just wasn't that much exciting stuff going on in the UK, particularly not in physics. And, you know, the US was where it was at. There was lots of energy in particle physics at that time, concentrated in the US. I mean, the UK didn't even have its own particle accelerator by then. There had been one at the Rutherford Lab years earlier, but it had been sort of it was outclassed by then and was being used for something else. But so it was kind of like, I'm going to move to the US. That means I'm going to go to graduate school in the US. That was sort of my next step, even though I'd only done 1 year of college. Um, and so then I get back to the UK and I'm mostly working on various kinds of particle physics. Uh, actually, I remember I wrote a bunch of papers that were quite good by that time. I mean, I'd written this paper, about various subjects, but okay, an interesting experience perhaps. Um, I got to know a chap called Nathan Isgur, who was a uh, American physicist who was visiting Oxford for a year or something, and actually, you know, he's based in Canada at that time. I only sort of realized many years later that he had kind of jumped to Canada to avoid the Vietnam War and subsequently came back to the US, ran a government lab in the US, unfortunately died a number of years ago. And and actually, ironically enough, I was reading some paper about a mathematical topic, and I sort of saw the name. I think it was Abraham Isgur, if I remember correctly, as an author of one of the citations there. And I knew that Isgur was a rare name because Nathan had told me that the name had been sort of made up at some point. And so I figured this must be a relation, and it's indeed the small world that it is. It was Nathan Isgur's son who had gone into mathematics, although I think has now gone into other things. In any case, Nathan was we ended up writing some paper together about well, I had been interested in by that time I was interested in cosmology and its relationship to particle physics, and the possibility of stable, heavy particles, heavier than protons, that could be left over from the early universe. And I'd sort of figured out how many of these things would be made in the early universe. It was kind of an interesting romp through physics because to figure out how many get made in the early universe, you have to understand things about general relativity, statistical mechanics, and quantum mechanics. And then there's sort of a big hunt for where do these particles go in the universe as it is today, if there are these heavy particles, heavier than protons and so on, heavier than nuclei and such like. But the other place they could have been made was in cosmic rays, and because they're very high energy cosmic rays around the universe, which could be energetic enough to make these heavy particles, even if they're never made anywhere else. And actually, at the time, there had been some kind of glimmer of an experimental result of some very bizarre phenomena in very high energy cosmic rays. But by this point, I was a bit cynical about experimental results because the previous, a few months earlier, I'd had the experience of predicting things from QCD, having an experiment say it wasn't true, but it turns out it was true because the experiment just wasn't right. And then having seen another experiment that had sort of, where its data wasn't very clear. So I was by this point wizened up to the idea that experiments are hard. And I wasn't really paying that much attention to these sort of anomalous results about cosmic rays. But in any case, I did want to work out sort of could these heavy particles be produced in cosmic rays? And Nathan Isger and I were sort of working on this. And one of the questions was, if you make these heavy particles, well, they collide with the moon and they go a certain distance into the surface of the moon, and they're going to get stuck there. And the question was sort of how far do they go on the surface of the moon? And to work that out, you have to work out the interaction probabilities between regular protons and things and particles like this. And I'm like, oh, well, I guess there must be some way of estimating this, and maybe people have figured out something about this. And then one of the things that for me was a very useful moment was realizing, oh my gosh, why am I saying this? I just wrote this paper that's sort of become the definitive thing in this area, working out how you work this out. Why am I looking for something else? And I guess the thing that sort of revealed to me is this point that I've seen so many times again, that when you create something, you're always like, well, I just created this. I don't know how solid it is. When I want to build on top of it, it's like I'm going to look around because, maybe there's something more solid than what I built, because I know that what I built is what it is, and it isn't sort of absolutely, in bedrock, because nothing is in bedrock, but you just know that if you were the one who created it. So it was a useful moment for me because it was kind of this after that time, I've always had the principle, if I'm run across some problem and it's like I can't figure it out, I don't know where to go, the first thing I think about is, do I already know the answer? Is something I've already worked on relevant to this? And I have to say, it's so common that I realize that the answer is yes, but I somehow discounted what I myself had done. And anyway, that was my moment for not doing that. But so there I was applying to graduate schools, and I guess I had interacted with people from Harvard, from Princeton, and from Caltech. And so those were the places that I applied. And well, the Harvard said, "Oh no, no, you don't have. We can't take you if you don't have a college degree." I said, "Fine." The irony of that in subsequent years was that it wasn't very long afterwards that they wanted to hire me as an assistant professor, and then I think associate professor, and at some point full professor. And I never went there. I mean, not because I was upset because they didn't take me as a graduate student, but just because things didn't line up that way. Somebody told me, and I, I, I don't think this is really true, but it's an amusing story nevertheless, that the only people known to have sort of turned down professor gigs in physics at Harvard are myself and Galileo back in the day. Not clear the Galileo story is really right either, but in any case, just a funny claim. In any case, then Princeton, Caltech. I happened to have visited Princeton when I visited the US a year and a half or so earlier, a couple of years earlier. And so that was sort of a known place to me. I'd never been to California. The furthest west I'd been was Chicago. And the and Caltech kind of offered me a better deal. So I ended up going to Caltech. And I think by the time I kind of I remember I packed up all my books and things into very neatly arranged boxes, and there used to be this thing called deferred air freight. I don't know if it still exists, where you could basically put your stuff somewhere and, it would get taken on a passenger plane at some point when, in the next few days or something. So that's how I sent all my stuff. And I figured I'm going to the US. I'm not really coming back. This is what I'm doing. So I I guess I went back to Argonne for part of that summer. And I'd also gone, gosh, I'd gone to some conferences and other places and so on. But in any case, the eventually sometime um, I guess late summer of 1978, I arrived at Caltech, which is in the Los Angeles area, and again, a certain amount of cultural kind of adjustment, like how come all this grass is so green here? It's really hot and really, and then I'm out a little bit late at night and up pops a sprinkler, and then I know why the grass is green. But I think I remember when I very first arrived at Caltech. I mean, the I went to the I arrived some evening. I can't even remember where, all the details of that. But um, and there was, I guess, in those days, things like university buildings were just open. You could just walk in, and the there was this building. It was called Rutherford Lab, which was the place where the theoretical physics operation or particle physics operation was on the fourth floor. Probably still is there. I think it was as of about 15 years ago, so maybe still is. Um, so, I go up there and I'm kind of wandering around this corridor, and there are sort of the names up on the door, and the two sort of the obviously biggest offices were M. Gell-Mann and R. Feynman. And in between them was a little office labeled H. Tuck that ended up being their assistant, Helen Tuck, a lively old person. But in any case, so I arrived at Caltech. I guess the person who was my most immediate kind of contact there was a chap called Geoffrey Fox, who was a British kind of phenomenological particle physics person at the time. And I guess I had had an interaction with Murray Gell-Mann because Murray, in a very Murrayistic way, had some months earlier had managed to call me in the UK, which wasn't, in those days, it wasn't like everybody had a cell phone. It was kind of coincidental that he managed to actually reach me on an actual phone, so to speak, and was like, doing his recruiting call type thing for, come to Caltech, it's great. I think he was a little bit disappointed that I was definitively not as starstruck as he might have hoped, and was, asking various practical questions and so on, which was, but in any case, so I remember I met Murray just maybe a day or so after I arrived at Caltech, and I had definitely, he says to me, you know, oh, this must be such a big sort of culture shock coming to California, and then he looks me up and down and realizes I'm wearing these kind of Birkenstock sandals and I'm wearing this bright yellow shirt and so on. And it's like, this looks pretty Californian, actually. I'm not sure how good I mean, it was just, that was what I happened to have because it seemed suitable for the weather, so to speak. But I think Murray was sort of taken aback that I wasn't as, it wasn't as sort of helplessly British kid as one might have expected. But anyway, so I got to Caltech. I There was at that point I had good access to the ARPANET. I had by that point a terminal in my office which was connected to I guess at that point it was everything the way you connected to computers. Well, okay, there were two different ways. One was there were actual wires running through the building, and the other was you would connect to a remote computer through a phone line. And so this was, and you would take the phone receiver, the old-fashioned phone with the, kind of typical Bell system, designed phone, and you would dial a number, you would take that phone receiver and stick it in these kind of rubber caps that would hold it and provide an acoustic connection. And then, the at the other end of the phone, you would start hearing the computer at the other end whistling in various ways. And it was usually at 300 baud, 300 bits per second. That was the typical rate. And then it went up to 1200 bits per second and so on. You would stick the thing in the acoustic coupler, and then you could start, and that the acoustic coupler was connected to a terminal, and then you could start interacting with the computer. So for me, my sort of favorite place to go on the ARPANET was the computer, the MIT MC computer, which was a computer that ran the Maxima computer algebra system. And so I became a very big user of that. I'd already started using it before, but became a very big user. It was notable when I first signed up for that, which must have been from the UK. The I wanted to sign up as you had to have a login, and so I wanted to be SW because why not? But SW was taken, I think, by a person called Sylvia Wood, if I remember correctly. Um, and so I picked Swolf, SWOLF. So for many, many, many years, Swolf was my login from that one moment of trying to be sort of the unique, having to make a unique identifier for that computer. At the time, there was already, the analog of email on that computer. It had a certain sort of, I don't know, MIT hacker kind of vibe to it in some ways. Like you would log in and it would say such a number of L users, like losers, on the system, and it would occasionally make various kinds of jokey sorts of statements. But in any case, the way it worked on the ARPANET at that time, you would dial in from Caltech to a thing called the TIP, Terminal Interface Processor, which was at USC actually. That had been a place, maybe, and also ISI, which was a company that had been involved in the creation of the internet. And also RAND, right? That was another tip in the area, RAND Corporation. Anyway, you would dial into one of these things, and the then you could get connected to that computer. It was also, again, a thing of the time. I mean, these were rotary dial phones, and actually there was a phone. Yeah, I guess I often used the phone. There's a thing called the FTS, the Federal Telecommunications System, and because Caltech had government contracts and so on, and I guess that group had contracts from what was then the Department of Energy. They had this FTS phones, and that allowed you to make essentially a free phone call to anywhere in the US. And the so that was another sort of way to get connected. I can't quite remember what I sometimes used that, and sometimes when I think it was faster to use that than to go through the ARPANET, so to speak, from a local connection. But anyway, so in the kind of fall of 1978, I was definitely in action doing physics research. I didn't. I think there were classes for graduate students. I didn't go to any of them. I did go to Dick Feynman was teaching one class, and I went to one or two lectures, and then there was sort of a homeworky thing, which I and which I sort of overdid because it was I forget what it was, but I ended up deriving something. It was actually somewhat interesting, sort of new thing, and Dick Feynman sort of said, "Don't come to my class again. It's you're irrelevant to my class." So I didn't. Um, but then I had a very productive time doing physics, kind of with my secret weapon of using computers to do algebraic computation and so on, which I had kind of really gotten into maybe a year and a half or so earlier, more than that actually, a couple of years earlier. And I did a bunch of things on QCD, some things with Geoffrey Fox. I have to say that the was definitely a case where Geoffrey was the kind of write the code in Fortran, and I was a like figure out what the theory should be type thing. And that was kind of the mechanism there. And then I wrote, well, let's see, the other thing that would happen at the time. I mean, I don't know. I have to really go check this, but I have the impression there was a period of time in the fall of 1978 when I was churning out physics papers at the rate of about one every 2 weeks. And I think that's true at least. And it was a it was a very productive time, and the papers have actually, I think, survived the test of time. And there are these things called Fox-Wolfram variables, which Geoffrey Fox and I invented. I used to sometimes refer to them as the three animal variables, but in any case, the get used in particle physics experiments and so on. I think to this day. But one of the things that was sort of going on at the time, well, there was a kind of a gaggle of graduate students who were significantly older than me, um, but who I got to know, and particularly, well, a number of them went on to do all sorts of interesting things. Tony Tarano, who was went on to be an early sort of physics and finance person, had a very successful career there. David Rees, who actually has worked for our company for many years now, um, another and a variety of other characters who went on to all sorts of different and somewhat interesting things, often not in mainline physics. Um, the but one of the things, there was sort of a regular kind of, I think there was a Friday theoretical physics lunch, and then there was a theoretical physics seminar, which in later years I was the organizer of. In those years, well, actually, maybe I had started being the organizer of that by within a year or so, certainly when I got to Caltech. Trying to remember the order of things here, but I remember that was like, everybody was sitting around. It wasn't a very big group, so it was people sitting around this table, and we would invite various speakers from various places. And I think at that point I had gotten to know Dick Feynman decently well, and particularly, and I think uh, he was always kind of in the, I think, a bit mischievous, and was always like, can I figure out the fatal flaw in what the speaker is saying? And he would kind of drum his fingers on the table, and uh, I guess he sort of had a competition going with me about who can figure this out, the fatal flaw first, which was kind of a bit childish and shouldn't have. But anyway, there was one terrible time when a chap who I think later went into finance, but I think he was a postdoc at the time, came to give a talk about uh, some particular feature of heavy particles and their effects in according to quantum field theory and so on. And I had figured out at some point in the middle of this can't possibly work. If you have the thing you're describing, where you get strongly interacting Higgs particles and this and that and the other, then the vacuum, the whole vacuum in the universe would be unstable. And so I'd sort of figured that out in the midst of this talk, and put up my hand and sort of said, well, by the way, how does this work? And the person was sort of uh, a bit embarrassed, and the whole talk kind of crashed and burned, which was sort of a terrible thing. But then the result of that was a fairly interesting piece of science. I ended up writing a paper with David Politzer, who was another, well, a young physics professor there, who had recently become famous because he was one of the people who in 1973 was responsible for kind of figuring out that QCD could work. This phenomenon of asymptotic freedom was kind of a long-running kind of debate about origins between him and a chap called Frank Wilczek, and a person called David Gross, who I actually had mentioned in a previous story, because who had told me a number of years earlier, oh, by the time you're in graduate school, all of QCD will be solved, which it still isn't. But in any case, the David Politzer was sort of a bright young physicist at Caltech, and he was almost exactly 10 years older than me, I think, within a day or two. And we ended up writing this paper together. One of the notable features of this paper, which is a bit frustrating, was, it involved some calculation in quantum field theory and so on. And it was like, I thought it was right, but David had done a bunch of it, and etc. And somehow the result was wrong by the fourth root of two, which is not a huge, it's pretty close to one, but it's not exactly one. And what the paper said was there can't be quarks or leptons that are heavier than about I forget what it was, 180 GeV, 180 times the proton mass, roughly. Well, whether that was that or 160 did make a significant difference. And there was a graduate student named Jeff Harvey who pointed out, who went through this calculation in detail and said, oh, you guys have it wrong by this fourth root of two, which was sort of embarrassing. But anyway, we got that fixed. I think David had, I don't know, it was one of my it was an interesting collaboration. I do remember uh, sitting one evening with David, and uh, I sort of feel for the situation because I was the eager young character who was figuring out a bunch of stuff, and David was like just hanging out there. And eventually, he says to me, he says, "I wonder whether any Scottish tartans have logarithmic markings on them," and it's like you are not paying attention at all. And in any case, uh, David subsequently went on. I felt like for many years he'd been kind of sort of kind of a little bit hanging out, waiting to win his Nobel Prize, which was sort of an inevitability for the discoveries he made in QCD. I have to say, visiting David in more recent years, um, I was uh, I was interested to see that on his shelf in his office, there's a cardboard box, or there was at the time a cardboard box with the marking Nobel shit, which was David said was all the stuff he'd picked up when he was in Stockholm. So I thought it was kind of an interesting uh, kind of arc of that. In any case, David has remained a friend since then, has gotten interested in all kinds of different sorts of physics, not I think so much particle physics. I think very different kinds of things. But in any case, uh, the thing that so spent a bunch of time doing physics at Caltech. I was traveling around giving talks and things and doing all the stuff that kind of physicists do. And I suppose I had had this sort of arc of that my teenage years had been, beginning of them, I was like, I want to be a physicist. At the end of them, I kind of was a physicist. And then I guess by 1979, I was uh, continuing doing particle physics on cosmology and things like that, and had um, and then it was kind of like, okay, what's next? So I've been in graduate school for a year and a bit, and it was kind of like, okay, Caltech was like, do you want to be a faculty member here? And I'm like, sure, that might be interesting. And in any case, there's no reason for me to be a graduate student. And then I'd also had visited CERN, I guess, in Geneva. And somehow by, this must have been the fall of 1979, I kind of had this job offer from Caltech, another job offer from CERN, and I had this sort of bizarre idea that maybe I would take both of them and sort of commute between Los Angeles and Geneva. And I think I always used to kind of enjoy the ride on halfway across the earth, or not quite halfway across the earth at that time. I have to say, at that moment, um, the this must have been a time when, well, I was using computers all the time for the things I was doing. I remember for some reason, I've never been a very good work from the office kind of person. And I quickly migrated to, working from the apartment I had. And I took home one of these, computer terminals, an ADM3A, I think, was, and I connected to an acoustic coupler. And then I was just amazed that you could just, local phone calls were free. So I dialed into my computer at Caltech, and I just left it connected all the time. And it never glitched for months at a time. I mentioned this once to Helen Tuck, the Dick Feynman and Murray Gell-Mann's assistant. She had previously, before she'd worked for them, she worked for the phone company, and she was like, "You shouldn't be doing that. It'll send a trouble signal to the plant type thing. You're being mean to the phone system, so to speak." But in any case, I was just impressed that it works so well. I think um, the thing. So I think at that time was I the only problem with being on a plane was I couldn't use a computer. And so I think that was right about the time when the Osborne 1 so-called portable computer came out, which was this thing that was sort of the size of a small suitcase that was ran an operating system called CPM, ran off floppy disks and so on. And I was like, okay, I'm going to get one of these. Then I can use the computer even on a plane. Well, problem wasn't a battery operated computer, but solution turns out in a 747, at least in those days, at the very, very, very back of the plane, you go back there and there was one outlet that I guess was used to, for cleaning the plane or something like that. I think I only ever actually connected to it like once. The whole thing was utterly impractical as a portable computer. The only thing that was perhaps interesting was going through Los Angeles International Airport with it at a time when there was now, airport security and so on, as being probably the first person or one of the first people carrying a portable computer through that. In any case, the after so eventually, kind of at Caltech, it was kind of like, am I going to be a professor type? Or at the time, they had this kind of research faculty track. And at the time, it was kind of like be an assistant professor or be a sort of research faculty person, kind of at the same level as an associate professor, but you don't have to teach. So I'm like, I'm going to take that because at the time, I had absolutely no interest in teaching. I thought it was just a pure drain. Now, to be fair, I had absolutely no experience with seeing what happened in college or graduate classes. And so I that was um, that was the so I'm not sure. It took me 20 more years to decide that teaching was an interesting thing. Now, I have to say there's something about this story that I'm realizing isn't quite in the right order because it must have been 1979, maybe it was 1980 by then, that I did teach a class at Caltech, a graduate class about foundations of statistical mechanics. That must have been 1980, so I'm getting ahead of my story. But anyway, so the the thing that okay, so I like taking this job. Well, okay, if I'm going to do that, I have to actually have a PhD, and that means I have to like do a thesis and all those kinds of things. Well, I had published many papers by that time, and so I'm like, okay, I'll put my papers together and call a thesis. Everybody was like, that's fine. Oh, actually, the other thing that had happened was that, in principle, I had to have sort of a thesis advisor, but in actuality, I'd just been writing a bunch of physics papers and many of them just on my own. And it wasn't really like I was not a heavily advised character, so to speak, by any stretch of the imagination. But Dick Feynman had said to me, you know, just don't have a famous thesis advisor like him, because he says, if you have a famous thesis advisor, you'll be known for the rest of your life as so and so student. You don't want that. You want to be your own thing. He also said to me, he said about himself, he said he'd never had a successful graduate student. He said, don't think that's quite true. And he said he thought he was sort of a curse on graduate students. He said that the one time he'd had what he thought was a success was a chap called Al Hibbs, who had come to him and said, um, he wanted to study the interaction of wind with water waves and asked whether Feynman would be his advisor. And Feynman told me that he'd said, well, yes, I know absolutely nothing about that subject, so I'm happy to be your advisor. And subsequently, he wrote a book about path integrals with Al Hibbs, and Al Hibbs later became a big person at JPL and so on. But in any case, so on Feynman's advice, it was like find the most junior person you can to kind of be your advisor. And there was a chap called Rick Field who was a sort of friend of Feynman's and was kind of a rather junior person there. And it's like, pick Rick. You should have Rick as your advisor. And I think Rick Field probably did all kinds of very respectable physics, but the wound up. I think probably perhaps his bigger personal claim to fame was that his sister was a famous actress, Sally Field, who had a lovely quote I actually right at the time when I was interacting with Rick. I think somebody had interviewed Sally Field and asked, and she said, "Oh, I have this brother who does physics, and I gather he's involved in inventing field theory." which of course wasn't the case, and she knew perfectly well it wasn't the case, but it was a funny thing to say. So in any case, then it must have been, originally I was going to put together for my thesis all the papers I'd written in the preceding year or so, which added up to about 800 pages. And yes, I've been a prolific writer for forever. Um, and the various people who were sort of assigned to my thesis committee were like, no, don't do that. We're supposed to read all this stuff. Don't put all these, all these papers together. So in the end, I kind of put together the short papers that I'd written and sort of called that a thesis with one of those banal titles like Topics in Theoretical Physics. And I guess my uh, thesis committee, who I interacted with only once, but was Dick Feynman and Rick Field and a guy called Steve Frautschi, a guy called Frank Scully, who was an experimental physicist, and a planetary scientist named Peter Goldreich, who I rather liked and who gave me some quite good advice at various times. But in any case, the thing, Steve Frautschi was, I have to tell one story about Steve Frautschi because he was always this person who would always seem like he was a little bit lost and would always be like, oh, I'm kind of late and I'm this and I'm that. And I've got to take my daughters to, I think, cello lessons, violin lessons, I forget, maybe violin lessons. And this was the, everything was, I'm late, I'm taking my daughters to these violin lessons. Okay, so, whatever. Here was that was nothing. So then years and years later, like 20 something years later, more than that perhaps, I'm back at Caltech and I'm wandering the same area in the fourth floor of Rutherford Lab. And I go past Steve Frautschi's door, and there's a great big poster there of his two daughters playing at Carnegie Hall, playing, I think it's violin. And so all those violin lessons actually paid off in this particular case, but it was sort of a funny arc there. I guess I should mention another person who I knew at the time was George Zweig, who was one of the inventors of quarks. He'd been a graduate student at Caltech back in the early 60s, and Murray Gell-Mann had come up with this very elaborate mathematical ideas that sort of led to the idea that there could be particles that would be constituents of things like protons. And George Zweig had this much more simple-minded argument, but had come to the same conclusion. He called them aces. In the kind of long arc of history, George definitely got the thin end of the wedge there. And everybody's heard of Murray's achievements, and people have not heard of George's achievements. And but anyway, George was a professor there at that time, and was somebody who gave me, again, quite good advice about lots of things. There's a sort of a long arc that followed that, which I might describe in some other story here. In any case, so I get to November of 1979, and I'm finally okay. I'm supposed to do my thesis defense. I could easily have done it a few months earlier. I just didn't put the effort into doing it, and that's a shame because then I could have said, talking of things you can say for the rest of your life, I could have said I got my PhD while I was still a teenager, but I missed by about 3 months. So, but in any case, I remember my sort of thesis defense event. One of the most notable things about it was that there was a small earthquake during it, which I thought was perhaps prophetic for something. But the thing rapidly turned into this complicated argument between me and Dick Feynman about the second law of thermodynamics, which happens to be a topic that I've worked on for many, many years and been interested in for a very long time. And I thought at the time that Dick Feynman's view of how that worked was crazy. And we debated that for a couple of hours probably. And I think I think in my understanding now of the second law, I do think it was crazy. And although there's an aspect of it that wasn't so crazy. I mean, it had to do with the idea that we must be a fluctuation relative to everything that happens in the universe. And that's the only explanation of how there's order in the universe, in a sense. I sort of, in my modern view of things about the Rulliad, I argued at the time, if you have a theory for him, if you have a theory that says that everything we see is a fluctuation that doesn't really follow the theory, that's a very weird theory. But in modern times, I've realized there's actually a sense in which that's not as off as it might be. But anyway, so I duly got my PhD, and then like a week later, I was off to CERN for a visit. I might have the date slightly wrong. It was November of '79 anyway. I wound up at CERN, and and then I was like, okay, I've had this thing. I'm going to be a physicist. Okay, I sort of am a physicist. Now what? And by that time, I had become very frustrated with Maxima and these other sort of algebraic computation systems. I'd kind of outrun what they could do, and they were always running out of memory, and they were always, doing things I just couldn't do the calculations of the size that I wanted. I suppose at the time, yeah, one of the big sort of things I had tried to do. Oh, that's right, I forgot quite a few other things, needless to say. Um, I um, I had I'd gotten very into Feynman diagrams, which is this way of computing sort of probabilities of things in quantum field theory. It's sort of the primary way of computing things in quantum field theory. Actually, Dick Feynman always used to deride Feynman diagrams and say that's what a stupid way to compute things. There's got to be a better way to do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, that was what one had at the time. And now, actually, in very recent times, I think I've figured out some things that sort of go underneath Feynman diagrams that I would have been enjoyed talking to Dick Feynman about. But in any case, the thing that was sort of the big thing of the time was compute Feynman diagrams. That was a big thing for using algebraic computation. And I had made this big sort of collection of all the Feynman diagrams. I think I've been an information collector all my life, but one of the collections I made at that time was all the Feynman diagrams that had ever been computed. What were the results? And then I was like, we're going to compute others. There was the two-loop correction to the E plus E minus total cross section was one of the big things. And for that, they tried to kind of develop a whole bunch of tooling, and particularly developed a bunch of tooling within Maxima. Built a thing called GAMALG, and what's the other one called? It was for gamma matrix, Dirac gamma matrix computations. And actually recently found the things I had written about that and Feynman diagram computation in Maxima. And I have to say, there were some quite prophetic things that I ended up saying about the way that what one would learn from computing large numbers of Feynman diagrams. But at the time, Tony Turano worked with me on that stuff, and actually I had come up with this idea that Tony turned into a quite well-known paper about using Gegenbauer polynomials. I had become by that time a mathematical special functions enthusiast. When you do algebraic computation, you bump into all these integrals and things that don't get done in terms of the sines and cosines and exponentials and so on, but in terms of these more exotic functions. And in fact, I had already, in my kind of efforts to to do integrals and such like, I had one was forced to know about all of these kinds of exotic special functions. It was always amusing at that time because I had become me in a computer was pretty good at doing integrals. Me on my own, pretty hopeless. But I would regularly be producing these things and putting in papers these weird formulas and so on. And people would like, where did you get that formula from? You must be an amazing calculator. And I wasn't. I was just it was me and a computer was pretty good. But in any case, and there were a bunch of other things that happened at that time. I mean, I suppose I I really had gotten to know sort of the international physics community pretty well by that point. But anyway, so after PhD, go visit CERN, kind of wondering, okay, so what do I do next? I'd kind of I'd kind of exhausted what could be done with the computer tools that existed at the time. I guess I had been through that year, actually. I had been kind of bugging the people who had built things like Maxima to say, look, you could do this a lot better. You've learned a certain amount from what you've done so far. Now you can do something better. And it was sort of interesting because the younger people who were involved, and most of them I knew only by email, so to speak. I was um, because there was this kind of email system on this MIT computer that ran this. Um, and I subsequently, decades later, I met some of these people, and they came across very differently in person. Well, decades later, at least, than they did in email. But in email, the younger ones were like, the only um, kind of the only things we can um, the Maxima is the best you'll ever be able to do. The the uh the older ones were like, yeah, yeah, you could do something a lot better, but you know, we're too old and tired and we can't get around to it. So anyway, so then there I was at CERN, and I was kind of what do I do next type thing. I was going to go back to Caltech at the beginning of 1980, right after Christmas, um, and I kind of made the decision, okay, I'm going to build my own system for doing mathematical computation, and so I started writing out these kind of design documents for the system, which its first name was Algae, the algebraic manipulator. Fortunately, that name did not survive. Um, but that was kind of the beginning of my I'm going to build my own system kind of thing. I think at the time, at CERN, there was a pretty vibrant kind of computing effort, and I knew a bunch of the people there. And uh, there was some, oh, actually, yes, there had been a person. Um, I'm scrambling a little bit the order of things, but there was a particular person then who was not at CERN, but many of his computational creations were there, a person called Tini Veltman. Tini Veltman was a Dutch physicist uh, who had written a thing called Schoonship, or as he said it, something like Hoonschip, or some other thing that I can't pronounce in Dutch, um, that was an algebraic manipulation system that had been used for Feynman diagram computations. Actually, there was a triple of these systems that had been used for Feynman diagram computation. A system called Reduce, written by a guy called Tony Hearn in Lisp. A system called Ashmedai, written by a guy called Mike Levine in Fortran. And Schoonship, written by Tina Veltman in the assembly language of the CDC 6000 series of computers. I've sometimes told this story and asked, of those people who wrote those different systems in those different language choices, which one do you think won a Nobel Prize later? Well, the answer was the one who wrote an assembly language. But that's just an amusing footnote to these things. But anyway, I had somehow, I think it was on that trip, I went to visit Tini Veltman in Utrecht uh, to to learn about sort of things about how you build these systems. And Tini had all these ideas. He was very much into, the absolute optimization of the absolute optimization of things, and was sort of responsible. Well, I was really responsible, but he was the one who kind of encouraged me to make a number of what turned out to be profoundly bad design choices in the system called SMP that was the future name of Algae, the algebraic manipulator. One of those design choices, particularly notable, was never store a rational number. Always store a floating point number and turn it into a rational by figuring out what rational number it corresponds to when you output it. And the reason was that at the time, particularly for these CDC series of computers, they were Seymour Cray's kind of computers that had been optimized for floating point calculations. And so floating point arithmetic was really fast. Integer arithmetic was really slow on those computers at that time. Anyway, bad design choice, which made it into at least early versions of SMP. In any case, so that was, I had kind of decided, okay, I'm going to do this thing of building this big computer system. And so I get back to Caltech, and I'm, about to do this. And a couple of things. First, I think, I should learn about computer science. So I go to the Caltech bookstore and I look for the section on computer science, and there's about, I don't know, maybe 18 inches, linear, inches of books about computer science. So I just buy all of them and start reading through them in a weekend. And that was computer science of its time. Those were books about, I think Don Knuth's books were there. I think Aho, Hopcroft, and Ullman, which is the books about compilers and so on, were there, and a couple of others about. Um, uh, and I guess by that time, yeah, how did I know this stuff? I also knew a decent amount about mathematical logic by that time. I can't really remember why. I can't remember why I had learnt that. But in any case, that was sort of my introduction to computer science through theoretical computer science. And I guess it had been a bit before that. I may be getting the order of the story a bit wrong, because I think by the time I was visiting CERN, I had pretty much some of the outlines of what I wanted to do for what became SMP were clear. In particular, the idea that sort of the big operation would be making transformations on symbolic expressions. That was kind of the big anchor idea. That is the anchor idea that's carried us through modern Wolfram language and many other things. That is sort of the fundamental computational operation that is both effective as a thing to do computation and a thing that humans can understand. And so when I started building SMP, that was a very key element, was this idea of pattern matching. And you have an expression that looks like this, and you want to transform it into one that looks like that. And kind of my early model for that was things like mathematical tables, where you would say, I'd use these integral tables and so on. It's like you have this integral on the left-hand side, it has this form. Anything that looks like that transforms into this. Now, at the time, there were a number of graduate students around who had um, a variety of. I'm trying to remember the order of these things, because I'm thinking there's a feature of the story that I'm uh, that the times are confused in my mind. But in any case, the uh, there was a graduate student named Chris Cole, who had been an undergrad at Harvard, I think, and came from Southern California, a very what could I say, a very polished kind of character, um, who had worked as an intern, I guess, at IBM, and was kind of like, I know about computers type thing. So he was involved in the very beginnings of SMP, and was made some sort of good contributions, knowing about things that I didn't yet know about sort of structuring computer systems and so on. Another chap who was around at the time was Rob Pike, who was a graduate student who I guess I briefly was somehow responsible for, um, and who had been, I think he was at University of Toronto before Caltech, came to Caltech. He was really into this thing called the Unix operating system, and into the C language in which that operating system was written. And he was like, trust me, C is the language of the future. And that was an important thing, because before that time, when I had written code, it was either in Maxima, which had a sort of top level Lisp-like, well, Algo-like syntax with kind of Lisp underneath, or it was occasionally in Fortran, which was kind of the typical language of scientific computing of its time. I mean, before that time, when I first started using computers, I was writing in assembly language, but by that time it was Fortran and so on. So anyway, Rob in 1979 was like, C is the language of the future. That's what you should use. Now, to a spoiler for later in the story, Rob went on to do many things, but eventually developed the Go language, so which I suspect he would now view as the language of the future. But in any case, sometime in the middle of that was a time when Rob was thinking of going to work at Bell Labs, at a time when Unix was really in its really at an exciting moment, and dropping out of graduate school and going to do that. And I was like, yeah, you should do that. And I remember somebody from Bell Labs, some sort of interviewer type person, coming through and asking me, is it really right for Rob to drop out? And I said, look, exciting things are going on there. This, why not? I mean, it was. I think Rob also had another contribution to my computational life, which was that in Fortran, it was very difficult to do recursion. In C, it's easy to do recursion. And I think I was trying to write something that did percolation. And somehow Rob was involved with that. And it's like, you can do that recursively. And that was probably the first time I had written a nice, clean, recursive program without sort of building my own stack or something to do it. Um, there's another chap involved at the time named Dom Mitchell, who was another graduate student who was into Lisp. Uh, and there was a little bit of a, you should take Lisp seriously. But in any case, so 1979, beginning of 1980, I'm starting to write this big computer system, and I kind of recruited some undergraduates. They had some, I don't know what it was, undergraduate research opportunity type thing, and we recruited some of those. Jeffrey Fox, who was sort of a much more plugged into the kind of the administrative structure, got involved, wrote some code. I think he wrote some things for integer factoring, for polynomial factoring. Um, and but I was churning out code at a high rate. We had some particularly good. Well, I think probably the most impressive of the student programmers was a chap called Tim Shaw, who uh, was both really was had a very good sense of system design and was a very good coder. Unfortunately, this did not interact well with his kind of sort of undergraduate studies, and he kind of, I don't know what happened. He sort of flunked a bunch of classes and things, and eventually he was like got into a situation where he's had to say, "I promise I'm not going to touch a computer." And then I discovered that he's dictating code to somebody else to write code. And at that point, I was like, "Look, you should." I think this was by that point, it was maybe a year and a half later, and already things were happening with SMP. And I'm like, "You should just work on this because that's obviously what you want to do." And in any case, then there's probably some other elements to that story which maybe I'll tell later. But in any case, uh, so there I was diving into building this big computer system. I was still doing a certain amount of particle physics stuff. And at the time, well, Rick Field and I actually worked on a bunch of things to do with uh, um, sort of how particles are produced in particle collisions and so on, and developed this kind of code, which, to my embarrassment, I was not the one who wrote this code. I was off doing, I thought great system design for SMP, but I didn't kind of say, well, let's take the code we're writing to produce these results for this paper and write and do my lifelong effort now of software design on that. And I think that led to this way of like numbering particles and setting up these codes that I think is still grandfathered in to today's particle simulation codes. And it's really not very good. And I'm embarrassed that I didn't put the effort in to understand that that was a thing worth, putting my design sensibilities into at the time. But then I uh well, let's see what happened next. I mean, I think I was continuing to do some particle physics kinds of things. Um, I um, oh, that's right. I'm missing a big piece of the story, which was a my efforts in cosmology. This must have been 1979. Uh, yeah, when I was still in principal, a graduate student, I started working with a chap called Rocky Kolb, who was a postdoc at Caltech at the time, and who was a sort of more of a dyed-in-the-wool cosmologist. And so we started working together, and the first paper we wrote together was about the expansion rate of the early universe. And we'd figured out that if there was a phase transition in the early universe as a result of spontaneous symmetry breaking, there would be, so that would affect the expansion rate of the early universe. And we'd figured out, I think I'd figured out that if certain things happened, you would get kind of exponential expansion of the early universe. But it wouldn't happen for very long. And the only way it would happen for a really long time is if the universe could supercool over a huge number of orders of magnitude. And so there I was trying to figure out, if you take water and you cool it below 0 degrees centigrade, how far down can you get before you start nucleating ice crystals and things like this? And it was like not very far. So it was, I was like, I don't think this is going to have a big effect on the universe. There'll be a little blip, in the expansion rate of the universe, but it's not going to be a big effect. And so we eventually relegated to a footnote the fact that, well, if there was a big effect, it would have this consequence that the universe would expand exponentially. And by the way, that would solve a bunch of problems in cosmology about the homogeneity of the universe and things like this. But I never believed it. And well, I mean, Rocky was, I mean, to be fair, we did put it in the paper, but later on, people sort of took that idea and were like, but this is, if this happens, it solves so many problems. Let's just assume it happens. And that became basically the inflationary universe scenario, and which was kind of again, it's sort of a lesson in history of science, which we had relegated to this footnote because we just didn't quite believe that the scales were weighted so much on the side of the payoff that we could ignore the fact that this really wasn't a plausible thing. Now, in subsequent times, with our current theory of physics, the inflationary universe in our model is no longer. It's an interesting story of the universe starting kind of infinite dimensional and then eventually sort of cooling down to be three-dimensional. And there's no need for this kind of artifice of inflation, which became more and more bizarre as time went on. But in any case, then Rocky and I worked on a problem that I had been interested in for a long time, which was why isn't there antimatter in the universe? In the early universe, there would have been matter and antimatter produced in equal amounts. How come in the current universe there isn't any antimatter around, or so it seems? I mean, it could have been that the Andromeda Galaxy was made of antimatter, but I had worked out kind of how much annihilation radiation would there be in kind of the interface. Not so much, not impossible, but then there were various other tests, and it really seemed in the end pretty implausible that every other galaxy was made of antimatter. And so that meant that there had to be some asymmetry, and there have been some glimmerings of ideas of how that might work. And then Rocky and I, and subsequently David Rees and Jeff Harvey actually started, it was mostly Rocky and myself, started really trying to nail down, how much, what were scenarios where this baryon asymmetry would be produced. It's just 1 part in 100 million of the excess of matter or antimatter that would be produced. And so that was, again, a very interesting combination of statistical mechanics, cosmology, quantum field theory. And I thought we did a pretty good job of figuring out kind of what the story was, but it required some assumptions about the way that particle physics worked, which, among other things, would imply that eventually the proton would be unstable, something that people thought might be a thing that one would see quickly around 1979, 1980, but it wasn't seen. But I thought we did some nice physics, and it was a great exercise in statistical mechanics meets relativist dynamics and so on. But in the end, nobody knows why the baryon asymmetry in the universe to this day. And people have sort of, I think, lost interest in the question, but we still don't know the answer. And it's something which one of these days I should look at again in the light of our recent physics project, although there's still a few steps we have to build before we can get to that. But in any case, so I had done these things in cosmology meets particle physics, and I'd then, right around that time, 1980, I was going off to lots of physics conferences around the world and traveling to all kinds of places. I have to say, I think one of the things after you get your PhD when you're really young, I thought, I fill out some credit card thing. It's like, let me get doctor on my credit card, and which I still have, even though I feel so silly about it sometimes. But at the time, it was kind of an interesting thing because you're, I don't know what, 20 years old or something, and you're renting a car in some weird place, and it's like you're giving you a credit card, and it's like, oh, you must be a respectable character, you're Dr. So and so, and occasionally you would get the and let me ask you about my medical ailment type thing, something in my hobby of the last few decades of knowing a fair amount about medical diagnosis. These days, I will be able to say something. In those days, I didn't have a clue. But in any case, so there I was, kind of being the traveling physicist, so to speak, going to all sorts of places. And I think I remember one time, must have been 1980, going to a conference in Poland, some small place south of Warsaw, And the main thing was there wasn't a heck of a lot of food. I was at my hungriest for a long time when I was there, but I also was the last time when I had really written something about the things that I'd been really into when I was a bit younger, about weak interactions, weak decays, kaon particles, and lambda particles, all these kinds of things that decay through what we now know as W bosons and so on. Um, and I thought I did a lovely job of writing a survey of these things that I don't think anybody has ever read, but has some cool physics in it. Um, but in any case, that was the thing I talked about there. I do remember when I going there, and it was, this was the Cold War was still very much in evidence, and Warsaw was a behind the Iron Curtain country. Poland was behind the Iron Curtain at that time. I remember going there, and I had all these papers in my suitcase, physics papers and so on. And the customs guy there is asking me, are any of these fiction? And so I, being probably more of a wag than I should have been, was, well, they're not supposed to be. I guess this was a time when there was restriction on sort of things going in and out of the country. Anyway, that seemed to satisfy the person. Um, I remember a subsequent time in sort of of those times, I must have been, oh, maybe a year or no, around that time, taking a magnetic tape, a big computer tape, into Switzerland. And oh boy, that was a complicated discussion about, what is on this tape? Is it valuable? Should you be paying customs duty for it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Um, anyway, the uh, I think so. 1980, I spent most of the time writing code for SMP. Um, I was and then sometime doing physics, this cosmology stuff, and then I think must have been right around that time I was uh, working with a chap called Jan Ambjorn, and we were working on sort of foundations of quantum field theory. And there was a series of papers that we called properties of the vacuum. And the first one was mechanical properties of the vacuum. It's kind of like if you take a piece of vacuum in a box and you ask what its properties are, well, there's a thing called the Casimir effect that causes sort of there to be more quantum field outside some plates than inside. And so that causes a small force of attraction between plates. And we kind of generalized that idea. And actually, that the thing that we did was something that subsequently somebody pointed out. Oh, you take these boxes of different shapes and so on, and we had these energy surfaces that we worked out. If you take these energy surfaces that we worked out and you go around this closed cycle in these energy surfaces, you can extract energy from the vacuum. And the person who figured that out is a chap called Robert Forward, who was also a science fiction writer in addition to being a physicist. And this I think seeped into zero-point energy as a way to power futuristic spacecraft. Some NASA studies on the subject, but also quite a lot of mention in science fiction movies, which was sort of the downstream effect of my properties of the vacuum effort. But then we had a part two, which was about electromagnetic properties of the vacuum. And then we advertised a part three about gravitational properties of the vacuum, but we never wrote it. And because I was distracted, and it was a time when Hawking radiation was just sort of it had been was really a lot in the news, so to speak, and it was a very relevant thing to understand the interaction between quantum field theory and gravitation. Um, and But we didn't write that paper. We had so many requests for that paper, and I've been saying to Jan Ambjorn for years now, we should just sit down for a weekend and write that paper, just because I haven't written an academic paper since 1986. So it would be kind of a fun thing to reprise that effort and do that. Plus, with our physics project now, I finally think I know what to say. Although actually there's some difficult calculations that have to be done. But finally we might do part three. One of my takeaways from that experience was never say this is part one. We're going to do part two, three, whatever. I did that a couple of subsequent times actually. But my main takeaway from that was don't advertise subsequent parts if you haven't already written them. Well, but mostly I was doing building SMP and kind of managing this um, this effort and churning out tons of C code every day. Um, and I remember probably well, at the time, I'd invited a bunch of people who had built other kind of related computer systems. Um, and there were ups and downs of that whole experience. The other thing that happened was I was, in doing these designs, I had this kind of group of people. It was my sort of focus group of how would people use this thing and so on. Dick Feynman used to show up to those uh, most of the time and had all these opinions about how you should create a system for helping with math because he was a serious, he was an excellent mathematical calculator himself. That was one of his greatest strengths. And so he had all these things about you should make sure you use this trick and that trick and the other thing. It was only in very recent years that I learnt that this Maxima system that I had used at MIT, that Dick Feynman was deeply involved in its creation in a slightly indirect way. I was actually writing an obituary for a person called Ed Fredkin, who I'd known for many years, and kind of learnt the story of how he and Marvin Minsky, sort of AI pioneer, and John McCarthy, kind of creator of Lisp, in 1962 or so, had been at Caltech, sort of trying to get John McCarthy a job there, and had sort of said, "Who are we going to call?" And they tried Linus Pauling, and he wasn't in. And then the next person they sort of tried calling was Dick Feynman, who was in, and they went to see Dick Feynman, and Dick Feynman told them, "Hey, if you guys are doing all this AI stuff, 1962 or whatever, you should do something that does math." And they took that seriously. And that was what turned into Maxima. I didn't know that story at all. And Feynman never told me that story. Um, you know, none of the people sort of involved and who were known really, I think Ed Fredkin sort of insinuated that story to me, but I never knew that story until very recently. So it's kind of a funny sort of small world effect. But in any case, uh, I think um, I used to, at the time, people used to say, uh, you know, a good programmer writes 5 lines of code per day, by which I think they mean write much more than that and then debug it for a long time. And I used to write, I don't remember how, I think I was at 2,000 lines a day or something was one benchmark that I had for myself of churning out C code and so on. In any case, I think more important than that was kind of the design of the system. And that got locked in. I mean, the very first designs that I did in November of 79 were a little bit Algol-like. And they got much more sort of symbolic and pattern matching based very quickly, perhaps too much so, in the sense that it was really sort of, there were lots of things that couldn't, that were, there was no way of doing kind of more traditional procedural programming and so on. Well, there were ways, but they were really messy. Plus, I didn't really understand the value of kind of, uh, well, of various kinds of syntactic simplicities. Although I did understand one thing, which was all the command names were short, kind of like Unix. Subsequently, when I got to know the guys who built Unix, they were like, "Hey, the great thing about SMP is it has short command names." That was one of the worst things about SMP, because when you looked at a piece of code and it was full of these very short 3-letter command names that stood for some obscure mathematical function or something like that, it was very hard to read the code. Part of the reason I did it that way that time is the typical person didn't know how to type. And so, the typical user of the system was going to be somebody who wants to, who's going to type, but they really don't, they're not 10-figured typists. I mean, I guess I had for a long time, I used a typewriter from when I was probably 8 years old, 7 years old, something like that. And a lot of the kind of the things I wrote typing them out. And my mode of typing was always, well, typically one finger. I'm surprised I didn't end up with a shorter left index finger than right index finger from that, or maybe a longer one from bone growth or something. But in any case, I was a one finger typist until I was, I think, 15 years old. And then one day I decided I'm just going to learn to type with 10 fingers. And I had this book which had a diagram of what you should do. And it was interesting that it was so quick. It took like an hour or two. And, because I knew where every key was. I didn't really know that I knew where every key was. But in any case, that was that was unusual to be able to, I was very, very fast at typing. I was as fast as everybody but the professional typist, so to speak, at that time, an advantage that I lost in subsequent years. I have to say, talking of typists, I do have to tell one story about Helen Tuck, the assistant to the theoretical physics group in general. So she used to type papers for people. So in those days, there was nothing, no notion of you would, create a paper on a computer. Um, I started doing that back in 1981, and I was sort of the first on the block, so to speak, to do that with all kinds of weird interactions with journals as a result. But in any case, back in those days, when you would write a paper, you would handwrite it out. And so for me, I was always handwriting it on these green pads of paper that were this very I don't know where that kind of concept came from, but these pads of paper where they would have kind of crust, they would have graph paper type stuff printed on one side, and then you would write on the back of that, which was something very confusing to me when I first was in the US and seeing this stuff. In any case, I would write that, and then I would write things, and when I would make a mistake, I would sometimes I'd white it out, and sometimes I'd put sticky labels over it, and then sometimes I would end up with scotch tape, many layers of paper of what the thing was supposed to say. But then in the case of at Caltech, Helen Tuck would be the person typing these things. I do remember one paper that I wrote, which was full of complicated calculations that I'd done by computer, and it was all kinds of complicated numbers of 19 over 97 or something like this. And anyway, Helen typed this paper, and every nine in this paper she typed as a G. And I'm like, why did you do that? She says, well, nobody ever has nines in papers. I mean, they're numbers like ones and twos and pies and squares and things like this. But nobody ever has nines in papers. Well, that's because basically people weren't doing these computations automatically. And so that just wasn't a thing that got generated. So I think just one funny story about those days. But in any case, part of the story of SMP was short command names because people didn't know how to type. I think the well by sometime in 1980, I think must have been pretty early in 1980. By the spring of 1980, SMP was starting to come alive. You could type something in and you get results back and so on. And it got more and more developed. I think the first demo I gave, semi-public demo I gave of SMP was probably in maybe January of 1981. And it was interesting because how do you give a demo of a computer system? Because it runs on on a computer, and that's a terminal and so on, and maybe it prints output, and that's line printer paper. How do you give a demo? Well, it turned out that at Caltech there was one device that was called a light valve, which was an LCD-based computer projector, and it was in the applied math department. And so I went over and collected this thing. It was a huge object, and so I was able to actually give my first sort of public computer demo using, well, this LCD projector as kind of an interesting thing that was possible, and that one was able to kind of remember that demo actually. And I invented this whole language for talking about symbolic expressions. We talked about things. I instead of talking about functions of f open bracket x y and so on, I talked about those as projections, and the sort of the arguments as being filters of the projection, and that led to this kind of way of representing. Sort of, I tried to unify the idea of arrays, like with indices 1, 2, 3, with the idea of functions with indices like x and the pattern x, which in SMP was $x. And that unification was not so successful, and kind of put me off those things for many years. It's probably delayed the introduction of what we call associations in Wolfram language by probably a decade or more. But in any case, that was my first demo of SMP. There was one thing to say about Caltech. Caltech was a very small place. I had not realized until many years later that most university campuses were vastly larger than Caltech. But at the time there was 700 undergraduates, 700 graduate students, and probably a bit more faculty than that. But very, very small place. But there wasn't that much interaction between different groups there. I mean, there was often another building was the general relativity people, particularly a chap called Kip Thorne. Um, and at the time, he and a guy called Ron Driver were all talking about gravitational wave detection and so on. And we were all excited about that. And I knew them and I knew some of the students who were working with them and so on. But there wasn't much interaction between those guys and like the particle physics crowd. Then there was a nuclear physics operation that where the young star of that was a chap called Steve Koonin, who I think took a terrible dislike to me. Probably not my fault, um, but he'd sort of been the star of the young physics crowd at that time, um, the in nuclear physics. But that was a different building, and there was very little interaction. And like when I went to get this projector from these applied math people, I didn't know any of those people, and it was sort of a shame really because it was such a small place, and there was there was a shame there was so little interaction. I mean, I think there were notable features of Caltech. I mean, it was, for example, it had this big building in the middle that was a library, but it wasn't a very big library because I guess some president of Caltech from the 60s had said, books are doomed. Let's not buy any more books. It's all going to be online real soon. Well, that was a few decades too early. I also remember Caltech being in LA. There were things that would happen, like, I used to ride my bicycle in to work every day. And one day there was a particular place actually near this library where there was kind of ornamental ponds and so on, a kind of a path that wound around down through these ponds and such like. And I prided myself of being a competent and fast rider of bicycles, um, which and so I always used to zip down that particular thing. And one day I'm doing that and I almost fall off my bicycle. And I'm like, is this some terrible, medical disaster that is about to happen to me and so on, losing my sense of balance or whatever else. And I'm kind of concerned about that. I go into the office and somebody says, "Did you feel that earthquake?" So that was a welcome to LA type moment. Um, in any case, so then uh, another big thing sort of in SMP was the documentation for SMP. So I started writing the documentation for SMP. It was the first time I'd used a computer-based typesetting system. I used a thing called troff, which was a typesetting system in Unix, and wrote a bunch of code that helped generate the actual typeset output, and ended up generating this big, thick sort of uh, kind of book about SMP with a big orange cover and so on. And that was the documentation for SMP. And that was June of 1981. Is that right? Around that time, I think. Um, yeah, right around then. Well, several things happened around that time. So then that was SMP is released. It's a thing. Version 1.0 is here type thing. And oh, I should have said, we'd had interactions with other folks, like I had done this kind of series of talks with inviting people to talk about other systems they'd done. One notable such talk was a chap called Richard Feynman, who was a young professor at Berkeley, who had been sort of involved in the effort to, yeah, that should explain more stuff. I mean, Maxima had been this project done at MIT, and there was kind of an effort. The guy who'd done it was a guy called Joel Moses. He was sort of leader of it. A strange character. I never really understood him. He always used to. His favorite expression, so far as I could tell, was, that's a horse of an entirely different color, which I never quite understood what that meant. But anyway, the he oh yeah, that's right. Many things happened in June of 1981. So, but we had invited these people. Well, okay, so Maxima had been developed at MIT, and then there was sort of an effort to spin it off as some kind of company. And that got, along with a bunch of Lisp technology and so on, Lisp machine technology, that got very ensnared in a bunch of MIT sort of hiring consultants to figure things out. Turned into two companies, one called Symbolics, one called Lisp Machines Incorporated, LMI. And anyway, the end result was that Maxima had been sort of locked in place with these machines and so on. Richard Feynman had been part of some effort to sort of free it in some way, which I think had not was in the end. I mean, the code base eventually made it out into the world for whatever it's worth. Um, but anyway, we invited him. I invited him to give this talk, and I think uh, he made the mistake of flying down to LA that morning or something. Was pretty tired, and he's giving this talk, and he's like a computer science professor, and I was in this audience sitting next to Dick Feynman actually, and Richard Feynman is telling these sort of computer science jokes, like he's kind of like we called our Lisp system Franz. Why did we do that? Well, because of Franz Liszt. And I think about at that moment, maybe it was another one of these things, Dick Feynman sort of stands up and says, if this is what computer science is about, it's all bullshit. And I think then walks out. And that was sort of one of those somewhat embarrassing moments, which I think I was sort of blamed for, even though clearly not my I was not the causative factor other than in organizing the talk. But in any case, the I think Richard Feynman uh, wrote sort of hate mail about things we were doing for decades after that. So sorry about that. Um, the uh, um, the thing that so then a couple of other things happened in the middle of 81. One was a conference about computer algebra systems in Utah, which I went to with Chris Cole, and it was kind of like that was a sort of a bit of a coming out party in the world of people building these kinds of computer systems for SMP. The problem was that at that very conference, Joel Moses was kind of the keynote speaker and had showed up in a complete kind of Moses cloak type thing, kind of with some tablet-like pronouncements about computer algebra. Well, the problem was that there we were with SMP, which was kind of a more modern take on on the whole story, and it was a very balloon bursting moment. And I don't think it was arguably not well received. There was a group of people there actually from University of Waterloo who kind of got the idea, I think, at that time, oh, we're going to build one of these systems too, and they built this thing called Maple that lasted for a while. Um, but the that was kind of my experience with the kind of that collection of folks. I have to say, many years later, decades later, I got some invitation to come to some subsequent version of that conference, and I was like, okay, so I would have been a bit surprised that after we built SMP and then built Mathematica and so on, that community had kind of always just, it was not a large community, had always just kind of ignored what we were doing, which seemed like kind of a mistake because we were actually making a lot of the stuff real and extending it greatly. But in any case, I was asking the organizers many decades later, so, you want me to come to this conference? I ended up going to it in the end. And, but tell me about it. And they said, well, you know about it. You went to this one in 1981, and it really hasn't changed much since then. And I'm like, we're 30 years later. There's got to be more to the story, but there I think perhaps wasn't so much. In any case, the uh so at that point, like SMP was out and about. Um, we Another thing that happened around that time was the MacArthur Foundation. So I'd seen this article, must have been in, oh, I don't know, early that year, about this foundation that was going to give fellowships to, wonderful people who were, and just like no strings attached kind of fellowships about uh, to just sort of do your thing for 5 years or whatever. I hadn't paid any attention to it, although I'd remembered it because I just thought it was an interesting article. So then June, it must have been, I think it was June of 81, I get this phone call. I'm about to actually go to this theoretical physics lunch one day. I get this phone call from some guy called Rod MacArthur. He's like, oh, we'd like to give you this fellowship. It's like, or we're giving you this fellowship. And I'm like, okay, what do I have to do for this? He says, well, really nothing. And you know, it was a kind of a weird conversation because it was kind of like I mean, the fact that I maybe had partly forgotten, but then remembered having seen this article about this thing from earlier, and so I wasn't quite as sort of surprised as I would otherwise have been. Um, but it was I kind of felt bad afterwards because it was like, look, thanks for giving me, this a bunch of money for a bunch of time, and that's really nice of you, type thing. Although it wasn't his money; it had been John MacArthur, his father's money originally. But in any case, I am so okay. So then I was like, oh, that's nice, and what of it? And then I started getting all these calls from reporters, journalists, and it was like, wow, this was the sort of first episode of the MacArthur Foundation giving out these fellowships and so on. And there was a media circus. And that was the time when I learnt don't have your phone number listed in the phone book. Because next morning, camped outside my apartment were a bunch of people with television cameras. And I'm like, no, no, I'm not doing this type thing. And so I arranged some kind of more organized kind of press conference-ish like thing. And that led to a bunch of articles. I remember one guy interviewing me, I forget, from one of the television networks. And he's like he says, this was the moment when I kind of learned I was really part of the entertainment industry in some sense. He said, look, I just came from interviewing a guy who lost all his money at Las Vegas, and now I'm coming to interview you, and you just got this whole windfall of all this money from this foundation. And so I'm like, okay, that's fun. And in any case, the so that was a sort of an interesting moment uh, of my first real sort of publicity moment. I have to say, actually, when I was a kid, I had sort of an almost publicity moment when I was probably 11, maybe. Um, for some reason, somebody England's a small country. This is an important point to realize in terms of the sort of globality of things, that it's a small country. And so there's a lot more kind of connection of you're going to know the people who know whatever. But at that time, there was a moment when I'd been doing all this stuff about space and spacecraft and so on, and producing all these never seen by anybody kind of, little books about that and so on. Um, and somehow was this television show called Tomorrow's World. God, I have no idea. Maybe it's even still on. And they, for some reason, I got sort of connected to some producer for that, and it was kind of like, oh, we want to do this segment about this kid who's into this space stuff, and so on and so on and so on. Um, I had many misgivings about it, and I was grateful that in many ways that it never happened. So that was my previous kind of brush with notoriety, but it got a lot bigger in the uh, in the MacArthur Fellowship thing, and I think I did have some interesting experiences as a result of that. Uh, I mean, um, I started getting, well, all kinds of strange mail from people, and I got people occasionally would show up at at the office at Caltech, which was kind of annoying. Um, Helen Tuck had lots of experience in this from being Dick Feynman's assistant for many years, and she had various things to say. I mean, she said things like, "Always keep the stuff you get sent." Because somebody may come back years later and say, "What did you do with that thing?" And I had various other comments. I've taken my own path in what to do with things like this subsequently. But in any case, at the time, uh, the I had this one moment where my picture was in all kinds of magazines and newspapers and things like this, and I had this one moment where my picture was like on the front page of the LA Times or some such other thing, and uh, I needed to go to the grocery store, and I'm like, do I have the nerve to go to the grocery store when my picture is on the front page of the newspaper? Or is this going to be too weird? And I'm like, what the heck? Interesting experience. Let me do this. And so there I was in the checkout line, and there were a rack of newspapers with a picture of me there. And of course, nobody recognized me. So that was which was not surprising really, but was kind of my moment there. Actually, it so happened, that's right, I remember, a few weeks after that, I was in England at some event in Cambridge. As an event organized by Stephen Hawking, actually. Um, and uh, Somebody recognized me on the street there from an article in an English newspaper. I think it was in the Daily Mail, if I remember correctly. It was a funny article. I mean, it was. I'm not a reader of things that get written about me, but this one was amusing because it was some British tabloid journalist comes and wants to interview me and sort of wants to ask me a bunch of everyday questions, right? Which, of course, I didn't know the answer to because they were things about British football teams that I wouldn't have known about, any time. And so this was made for a fairly amusing article about, physics whiz, kind of is clueless about everyday life type thing, which was rather fun and probably had more kind of traction than more staid types of articles. But in any case, the so after that, uh, I was really doing the SMP thing, and sort of I suppose the next big thing that happened, and maybe this will be my last story fragment um, for uh, today. Well, it's a bit of a long story fragment. Okay, I'll go into it anyway. The Was okay. I built SMP. It's clearly going to be useful to people. People wanted to use it. It was kind of a thing to distribute. It's like, what am I going to do with this? Um, Big software system, needed effort, needed maintenance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, needed development. So I'm like, okay, Caltech must have some mechanism for turning this into a product type thing. So there was a technology transfer office which consisted of this one part-time white-haired guy, a very pleasant old fellow, who was the technology transfer office. So I go and talk to him and I say, well, we developed this thing and it's this and it's that. And so he sets up some meetings to sort of talk to, I suppose, potential licensees. And the meetings were disasters. They're just completely the wrong, inappropriate mismatch type things. So I go back and I say, you know, these meetings were not successful. How come? Don't you know how to do this? He says to me, I remember one afternoon sitting in this chap's office, he says to me, well, you know, we don't do this very much. Most of the time, faculty members who invent stuff just go off and start their own companies. And so I said, well, can I do that? So he goes over to his bookshelf and he says, well, let me look at the bylaws of the university. He pulls down this kind of thing in a little light green binder of, this sort of loose leaf bound thing and starts looking through it. He says, well, yes, it says here copyrightable material is owned by its authors. And software is copyrightable. So yes, you can do that. And I said, okay, write me a letter that says that, and off I'll go. You won't hear from me again. And so I got that letter, and then it was like, okay, what do I do now? Now it's kind of on me to start a company. Well, Chris Cole, who'd had sort of this IBM experience, and also, as it turned out, had been involved in starting another company with some people he knew from IBM, was like, oh yeah, you can do this and this and this. And I still sort of had the self-image that I was just a, physics kid who didn't know stuff about things like starting companies. And I remember going to the Caltech library was and looking for these books on management and finding this ridiculous book that I think the page that I got to was a page that had a diagram of the manager talking to the employee, and it said, the manager's desk should be several feet higher than the chair that the employee is sitting in. And I'm like, this is just nonsense. And so I didn't learn anything from books about management, so to speak. I mean, to be fair, if I had really done a bit better self-analysis, I'd been running stuff for ages. And, even this project had been a thing that I had run this project of managing people to write code and so on. And there was a group of probably, I don't remember, eight or 10 people, and there have been some others who've been part-time people. Some of them went on to quite interesting subsequent careers. Um, the uh, there was it was an interesting bunch. I remember there was a chap called Larry Romans who was a rather colorful physics graduate student at the time. And one of the features was that he always wrote all of his code on one line. C doesn't care what lines things are on. And then he would also write code so that he would have often rather bizarre and sometimes obscene references where there would be one function with one name, another function with another name. And at some moment, one function would have to call another function, and that would create a thing in the code that said something that was really bizarre. Um, I think that was one of our cast of characters. Um, there was another chap called Eric Molesness, who's become a kind of computer science professor and gone on to all sorts of things. Uh, and let's see, there was also Tony Tarano was part of that crowd. Um, and oh my gosh, who am I forgetting? And Tim Shaw, I mentioned. Oh, and then later on, a chap called Jeff Greif, who was at that time a physics graduate student, later on worked for many years for the company that was working with SMP as kind of the main maintainer of SMP. But in any case, um, I will say that SMP had a bunch of kind of good design ideas, some bad design ideas, some good implementation ideas, some freaking insane implementation ideas that I take some responsibility for. Uh, but in any case, the it had, I mean, it's a rather technical thing. One of the things it had was a semantic pattern matcher. So I was obsessed with the fact that if you had a function f and it had arguments 1, 2, that if the pattern had been what in Wolfram language would now be f of x blank, y blank, x blank plus y blank, that would match, that it would semantically match. This turned out to be so complicated to implement because it meant that the evaluator had to be kind of interwoven with the pattern matcher, something that a mistake not made in Wolfram language. Um, uh, um, the So in any case, the thing that back to the story of what happened with SMP and its kind of the dynamics of what went on. So at that point, it was like, okay, you know, um, I guess I have to start a company. There's a chap, physicist named Barry Barish, who subsequently became famous in various things to do with gravitational wave detectors, but was at that time an experimental particle physicist, um, who was involved with um, the uh, the Department of Energy contract, I guess. Yeah, there's many pieces to the story, as there always are. One of the things that had happened was a VAX computer, which was this big computer that was a big mini computer. That was the computer on which SMP was developed, and it had been got through this Department of Energy contract. And I guess I was already involved. Yes, I was involved at that time. And one of the big things was it was running Unix, and that was sort of a newfangled thing for anything to do with physics to be, you know, anything to do with Unix and C and so on. In any case, Barry had this friend named Alex Jacobson who had been a manager at Hughes Aircraft or Hughes Research Labs. Actually, ironically enough, the place that had developed, he'd been in charge of developing this light valve projector that I had used for this first demo. I didn't know that until much later, but he had been, you know, he'd gotten a PhD in applied math, I guess, at Caltech. Then had gone off to Hughes Research Labs. Was in his 40s by this point, but was a guy who was, you know, really was trying to be very entrepreneurial and kind of started some sort of semi-AI-ish kind of operation and was very hot to trot, you know, let's do this company type thing. So we started building this thing. It was kind of, I guess I probably started this. I must have started it before he came along because it was already named Computer Mathematics Corporation. And my theory of the case was that Chris Cole, who was at that point a graduate student in physics, that this would be kind of his thing, that this would be, you know, his kind of big activity. And that was that seemed like a good theory at the time. And so anyway, created this company and carved up the pie in ways, some mistakes I didn't make subsequently, about carving up the pie to people, giving slices of the pie to people who say, I'm going to do all this stuff. And then they don't. And in modern times, there are all these notions of vesting and all that kind of thing, which make it easier to do pie carving that makes more sense. But at the time, that wasn't a thing. In any case, we start to do this company, and I forget how far it had got, but at that point, there was this big. Actually, there had been multiple disasters. There was another disaster when, at some point in the middle of this, Geoffrey Fox had gotten it into his mind that he wanted to take over the project, and that was a complicated rebuff of that little disaster, which I think in the end everybody's friends, but wasn't at that time. And there'd been a chap who'd been the chairman of the physics department at that time, named Robbie Vogt, who was not helpful, I would say, in the whole thing, and really inflamed that situation much more than it needed to be. But anyway, then I forget all the dynamics of what happened, but the main thing that happens is companies getting launched, and then it's like, wait a minute, from the Caltech administration, you can't do this. You know, and the particular guy who was most sort of involved in that was a person called Jack Roberts, who was the provost at Caltech at the time. He'd been the president of Caltech was a guy called Murph Goldberger, who was a physicist. In fact, Murph had been a professor at Princeton right when I was trying to decide whether to go to graduate school at Princeton or Caltech. And I talked to him at that time. I can't remember the whole context of it. But then suddenly I show up at Caltech, and it turns out he's just moved to be president of Caltech. He'd been a physics professor at Princeton, and he was a person much involved in this thing called the Jasons, which was this defense consulting operation. In any case, he was then president of Caltech. This guy, Jack Roberts, had been, I think at Caltech for a long time and had really been kind of going for the presidency position, and was kind of, Murph Goldberger had kind of been hired over him, so to speak. So Jack Roberts wasn't very happy about that. Definitely didn't like physicists, partly perhaps for that reason, maybe for many other reasons. He'd been a person who'd been kind of a pioneer in NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance, uses in chemistry. He'd also been the author of a well-known chemistry textbook. Any case, Jack Roberts had this whole production about how you can't do this. This is owned by the university, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, I'm like, look, here's this letter that says we can do this. Get stuffed. And it all got very unpleasant. And and I think then what happened? A whole series of things happened. My gosh. Well, maybe I shouldn't tell this story now. Maybe I should wait and tell this story the next time, because I think it's going to get to be a fairly long and rather entangled story. Many aspects of which I don't think I've ever told before. So this will be fun to tell. But I think I should let me just see if there are any very specific questions that I can answer and then I should wrap up and go back to my modern day job. Snow Sneaky had asked ages ago, what was the most interesting subject you learned about in university? Well, I really didn't do the whole college thing, and I was really off doing physics research. So that was, I didn't have the university experience, so to speak. Sadi asks, do you have early mentors or role models who encouraged you to pursue science? No, not really. I mean, I got interested in science from looking at books. I think in some ways I did science because it was antipodal to what my parents knew about. My mother was a philosophy professor. My father ran a company and wrote novels. And both of them, if there was a science thing, it's like they didn't know about that. So that was kind of one of the attractions to me, in a sense, was, I suppose, something antipodal to parents. Of course, in subsequent years, I've done things that are quite philosophy oriented, and I've done things that are quite run a company oriented. I haven't written any novels, though. But so it happens. John asks, did you ever get bored in school? Did you always feel like you had something exciting to work on? When I was in high school, I was always doing these projects on my own. I mean, I went to boarding school, and most of the time I was really doing these. I was either doing my homework or I was doing my own physics projects and so on. In terms of the classes that I was taking, it was I have to say um, I think I had pretty good teachers for the most part, and I was always uh, I think I found them reasonably interesting. Um, I remember was a Latin teacher called David Simpson. This was when I was in high school at Eton. Um, the Who many people really didn't like. He was a very precise man, and I rather liked him because I'm kind of into precision myself. And in any case, I years and years later, I'm opening a Latin dictionary that I've used for many years. I used to help make up names for things, and who should I find out was the author of that dictionary, but the very same David Simpson. So that was just an experience of I didn't know it at the time. I mean, it really is a notable thing about those times versus now. There was so much one didn't know. I mean, in today's world, if I'd known a bunch of these kids in school and there'd been sort of this this impression that there was some whole complicated family backstory, I would just have looked it up on the web. But in those days, you couldn't do things like that. So uh, Crab is asking, do you remember your address in Oxford? Yes, the first house my parents had in Oxford was at 101 Southmore Road, and the second place was a uh, was the address was flat 3. Flat means apartment in England. 1 Fifield Road, Oxford. And yes, I remember all those things, and they're not useful anymore. But the um, uh, the phone number was Oxford 56186, and they had this small house in Kidmore End, which in those days, every house had a name, so it was called Norton Lee. I don't know why that had been named by the previous owners, something north end of the Lee of something or other. Um, and so that was, the postal address was just that Kidmore End near Reading, Berkshire, except that it was in Oxfordshire in a typical old world weirdness. Um, but that had a phone number that was Kidmore End 2378. It was only a 4-digit phone number. And one particularly knew these phone numbers because the convention of the time was when you picked up the phone, you said the phone number on the grounds that maybe people would have been connected to the wrong phone. So yes, that was uh, um, well, Elsie is asking, what made you choose the US over Oxford? At the time, sort of the US was where everything was happening, for example, in physics and so on. It was all the discoveries, all the theory stuff, all the people, all the, well-known universities and so on. It was the place, so to speak. And England was kind of just like sort of a pale shadow of that. Sort of a shame because in a few decades earlier, it had been sort of, the leading place, and the US had been kind of and also ran, but I think that really flipped around at the time of World War II, and the US really, particularly invested in physics after things like the Manhattan Project, the radar. Well, I guess radar had been developed in the UK, but that for some reason didn't induce a lot of physics work there. I think it mostly went to companies, not to universities. Um, Let's see. Elsie asks, given subsequent interest, do you consider get anything other than physics, say in the direction of computer science or engineering or anything like that? No, I didn't. I was interested in physics and nothing but physics, so to speak. And I think I had I used mathematics and physics. I actually did learn a decent amount of pure mathematics. I remember in Oxford, a chap called Michael Attia gave a bunch of lectures about algebraic topology and its relationship to quantum field theory. It's very early days of that relationship, and I eagerly went to those and actually ended up being sort of a person who was able to interpret some of the sort of what came from fancy math in physics and tried to see how that was connected and so on. Um, and So I did know a certain amount about math, but I never did kind of the pure math, write proofs of elaborate, angels on heads of pins. No, that's a bit unfair, kinds of things in pure math. And I was never drawn to that at all. And I had been, in terms of math, I had learnt math because I needed to use it. And, I'd never done kind of competition math. I remember there was math Olympiad type stuff was happening. I remember I was supposed to be sort of a competitor in one level of math Olympiad the very last day I would have been in high school. And it was like, I also, very last day I would have been in high school was also the first time in my life I had stayed up all night, which was both a big mistake and rarely repeated, and was definitely not the setup to do, math Olympiad. I didn't do it. And yeah, I should say that back in those days, I'd been a space enthusiast. So I remember 1969 staying up, or maybe waking up in the 2 in the morning or whenever it was to watch the Apollo 11 moon landing thing, because that was prime time American television time, but it was shifted in the UK. Um, uh, let's see. Um, Total asks, did the size of the US give me a shock in comparison to the UK? I don't know, you fly to a place you don't really know what's there. I mean, in the UK, I had in the last year I was in the UK, I'd had a little car, and it was sort of unusual in having a car. And I guess it's because my parents lived in Oxford, so I could like park the car at their place, and there wasn't, I think, for general students, there wasn't really a place to park a car. But it was, I remember driving from Edinburgh at lunchtime to Oxford at dinner time, and it was like you could drive the country, so to speak. Um, I didn't really internalize the size of the US, other than just you take a plane to get from here to there. Um, and in terms of sort of the size of the community in the US, again, I was very plugged into the international physics community, which is kind of its own thing of whatever number of thousands of people and very international. And you don't really get to see the size of different countries that way. I mean, in subsequent years, it was always very notable to me that sort of the people I knew in high school, or whatever else, those were the people who ended up, running the country or whatever else. And it was a small group, and they were, kind of not, it's like, yes, of course I'm going to know the person who is in that, role or whatever else. Of course, I went to the same school as that person, whatever. Um, it's kind of the I never had a chance to use the quotes old boy network. Kind of a shame. I mean, my friend Nicholas Comac, who I mentioned before, uh, when when I left Eton, he said, "You've just got to go and buy an old Etonian tie." It's just a thing. It's a kind of a dark background. It has these light light blue stripes in some direction, thin stripes. Says you've got to buy one of these. It's critical you buy one of these. So I said, fine, I'll do that. Go into the shop. I think with him actually, and they're like, well, let us check on the list. Are you entitled to buy this tie? And it's yes, yes, I'm entitled to buy this tie type thing. I have to say, for a long time, it was the only tie I owned, and at some point, many years later, I had it in my pocket. I was in London and there was some fancy club I was supposed to go into and meet somebody there. And it was like, oh, we ties are needed here, sir. And I get out my old Etonian tie, and it was like, oh yes, of course, sir. So that was my only moment of the old boy experience, so to speak, with that. Plus, I also, knowing what an old Etonian tie looks like, you realize that things like, the Yes Minister television show and so on, there are those ties in all the right places, so to speak, there. So a funny country. But so that's a very different story in the US. And the fact that it was, that one, so it's a much more distributed kind of setting, and one had the assumption one didn't know people who were running this or that in the US. I mean, that's changed a little bit for me now because I've gotten a much bigger network, but certainly when I arrived in the US, that was the case. And I think also I mean, there were many aspects of American, uh, well, I mean, there were just a lot of things that were definitely different. Um, and um, I found mostly I like the American way of things. I mean, in um, the uh, the British view of the U.S. at the time was very much the U.S. is this crass place full of people without style and so on. I remember that the kind of remember people telling me, "Oh yes, the proper British accent is this one from the British Midlands and so on, or whatever the slightly upper class in England. There's a lot of coding of socioeconomic, layer or something by accents." And people, I remember somebody telling me, America, the accent comes from Cornwall, which is this kind of, the thing in the southern part of England, which is sort of off in the boonies. They're imitating the Cornwall accent. It's very, it's the boonies, so to speak. I kind of think these days the UK has in many ways turned into an American colony, ironically enough. But that was sort of the mood of the time towards the US, and also a certain sense of in the US, everybody is kind of posturing themselves to be, the expert in this or that or the other. Kind of the exact opposite of the UK situation where nobody can claim to be the expert. And I always remember sometime when somebody was playing ping pong or whatever, and they're like, I must change into my special ping pong uniform or something to play ping pong. And I'm like, this is not what happens in the UK, at least at that time. Probably changed since then. Let's see. Uh, the Elsie is commenting, I think, in connection with my computer and I are smarter than I am on my own. Apparently, Einstein's quote of my pencil and I are smarter than I am. Um, let's see. Uh, okay. I see somebody from my team asking me the pointed question, how many meetings are you regularly late for? And I see that I'm almost all the way through. I've got 3 minutes left in a 1 hour meeting, so I really better go to that. And thanks for indulging my strange oral history uh, uh, world here. And well, for next time, I guess I get to go on with this. There's a lot more years to go through, but it's going to get quicker, I'm pretty sure. Next up is the story of my first company and my eventual departure from Caltech and a few other things related to that. So I look forward to telling you about that another time. Bye for now.